Those of you who take your daily exercise along the high street and past the church might have seen new images out the front and on the side. One of those images looks a bit like a label or a price tag, and there are some numbers on it. If you look closer, you might see that it looks like there's something else underneath. And those numbers, are they significant numbers? I wonder if you've seen them, how those images or the numbers make you feel. When Aberdeen Football Club signed a new striker called Stevie May, he chose an interesting number for the back of his shirt. He chose number 83. Unusual. Typically the numbers on footballer shirts go from 1 to 11. So why 83 for Stevie May? Well, knowing that depends on your history. Depends about where you were brought up or what you're interested in. If your history is as an Aberdonian, then you'll probably be able to connect the number 83 with a year, 1983, and maybe even a month in that year. This is a significant moment for the city of Aberdeen. On May the 11th, 1983, so May 83, Aberdeen Football Club won a competition known then as the European Cup Winners' Cup. And they beat a team called Real Madrid 2-1 in Gothenburg. So when a footballer signs for Aberdeen with the name May, his shirt will get more sales if it has the number 83 on it. It's a number that itself is not particularly significant, but as it connects with a city, a community, a history, then it becomes something more, not in a logical sense, but on an emotional level, on an imagination level. It makes certain people who share the same history feel something. There's an ancient letter tucked at the end of this collection of books we call the Bible. And that letter is full of numbers and symbols. It would be easy to sit down and to read this letter in our 2021 culture and read parts of it as if it was some sort of weird dream or fantasy or a kind of horror Netflix box set with mythical beasts and dragons and angels in it. But that would be to treat this piece of writing unfairly, because this is a 1st century letter written a long time ago to be read out loud, not to be read on the page, to be heard by groups of people who were mostly Jewish and living in the 1st century in the ancient Near East, trying to live out a movement centered around the life and the death and the resurrection of a Jewish teacher called Jesus of Nazareth. And doing all this in the face of the mighty Roman Empire of the time. So as these 1st century listeners were hearing this letter read out loud, they weren't thinking about weird dreams or nightmares or fantasy box sets. Instead, they would recognize in these pictures being described as symbols, numbers that meant something to them, that moved them because they were part of their collective community story. They would hear, they would see in their imaginations a Jewish story. In numbers like 7 being the symbol in their scriptures for completeness, for goodness, for their creator, God. They would hear a story about a woman or a bride as another story about God's people, the Jewish people known as God's bride, made for a relationship with their God. So often messing that up and chasing off after other ways and other gods. When they see a story that describes someone being taken up a mountain that also mentions plagues, they Don't imagine John floating up Ben Nevis with the mumps and the measles. In their story, a mountain is where God meets his people. In particular, in a story called Exodus. And I keep arguing that the Jewish identity, the Jewish story, the Jewish roots are in a book called Exodus. This collection might start with a set of poems called Genesis, but the real roots of the Jewish identity is in a story of Exodus, the story of a God who hears the cry of a nation of slaves and sets them free through a man called Moses, and then through a set of plagues that finally push that particular empire to let God's people go. Turns out, as we work our way through this letter, Revelation, that his crazy experiences, images, perspectives, this collage of ideas is the same story again. Here we have a group of people in slavery, crushed by an empire, a destructive system of shortcuts about pushing consumption, pushing the idea of power, pushing the idea of self-centeredness, a system that slowly grinds away the Jewish people from being who they were made to be. And they cry out, how long? And in a set of these visions in this letter that show up the reality of the opposition, the reality of the situation, what's going on, and also reveal that their God is always still at work. The idea of these plagues in this letter is just another way of showing up those consequences, showing how the empire, in working against what God is doing, actually tears itself apart. And in these visions, God's people will eventually find freedom. God does that, makes them free to be who they were made to be, for that relationship with God. This is a God who is always at work and who is always putting his creation back together, making all things new, as he said. As they hear this letter read out, they hear again their story. In that first Exodus story, as the people waited at the bottom of that mountain to hear what God was saying, they got fed up, they got impatient, and they made their own gods, famously a golden calf. It's no different in Revelation. While they are crying out in the images that John portrays for them, at the same time they are chasing after so many of them fake gods, making their own gods, and they're represented as beasts or dragons or prostitutes. They're known as Babylon or Rome or whatever the latest version of the opposition to what God is doing is. This is not a story of fantasies. This is a story of realities, of history, of our human history revealed again. But it's not a cycle. It's not an ever-repeating cycle that never ends. This story has always been going somewhere, and that's why in Revelation we have a vision of where things get to. And this vision is of a God having dealt with everything that gets in the way and then coming himself to be with and in his restored creation. And so the vision, as we've seen, is of a city, a new Jerusalem. Sometimes people who hear that this set of stories begins in a garden and ends in a city understandably say, I don't really like cities. They're dirty, or they're cramped, or they're polluted, or I prefer the open spaces in the countryside. That's to miss the point. If you've been working your way through Revelation at all, if you journey like I have through these 21, 22 chapters, then it would seem to me a bit strange right at the end to suddenly start to take things literally. We're not talking about a city like the fake cities of Babylon or Rome or Egypt or whatever the particular empire of the time symbol is being used. This is not about a concrete jungle. This is not about smog or pollution or overcrowding or congestion charges. This is imagery that describes things that are called the brilliance, the glory of God. The Hebrew word in there is a word that's based on an idea, a concept that is repeated all the way through their stories of the presence, the Shekinah of God. The city image is of where God dwells, lives, pitches his tent. It's not a picture of an actual city made of literal jewels or paved with literal gold streets. Notice that John repeats the word like. It's like, it's like, it's like. John is wildly trying to capture an experience, a glimpse of how things are and how things will be. So it's not about a city as in buildings or built in a grid pattern like the cities of the Roman Empire. This is a vision of a city, and this community is where God lives. It's not made of buildings. Look again at the description. Look at the foundations. Look at the gates that are mentioned. In the Exodus story, the slaves who were set free were given not just freedom, but an identity and a task. They were God's people to be partners in fixing, in mending, in healing his creation, their creation. And as they journeyed with their God, they were given ways to connect with God and to learn more who they were made to be. One of those was a temporary space known as the tabernacle that travelled with them. And later in David and Solomon's time, that would become a temple. These ideas here described in Revelation of the city are based on all sorts of descriptions that they already knew about the tabernacle and the temple. The foundations here are mentioned as having 12 precious stones in them. In the sacrifice and worship and connection system that God gave them, their high priest Aaron had to wear an elaborate 12-stoned breastplate to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's the same 12 stones here. This city concept has 12 gates, and on them are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it has 12 foundations with the names of the 12 disciples or apostles, witnesses they're called, the students, the followers of Jesus that he chose to be with them and to represent and to carry on this movement, showing that this movement was never just about the Jewish people, but always about all God's people. We've seen these numbers in 12 plus 12 threaded all the way through the stories and the visions and through this letter, that the Jewish story is now the story of all God's people. That this movement has become a movement of all peoples and all nations, and in fact all creation, which was always part of the plan. And there are measurements. Look at the measurements. Sometimes translators try and help us by working out these distances in miles and kilometres. But knowing that this city would be 1,500 miles long and 1,500 miles wide doesn't actually scratch the surface of what is going on in this letter, in these ideas. Because what the writer wants us to hear is not the actual distances, but the actual numbers that he's written down. 12, the number of the tribes, or the number of the disciples, multiplied by 1,000, the Jewish idea of hugeness or completeness in the 1,000. And the thickness of the walls, 144 cubits. This is not about how actually thick they are. This is about 12 times 12, about multiples of these symbolic numbers. This is not just about huge distances. This is about what and how and who this city is made of and for. Did you notice in the middle of the measurements that it's not just length and width, but it's also height? This is not just a nod to the Roman system of grids. These describe a city that is somehow a cube. What's that about? Well, right at the heart of what was known as the tabernacle, this temporary space in the desert where they met and connected with God, and also in their temple in Jerusalem, was a place called the Holy of Holies. And it was a perfect cube in its dimensions. And only the high priest could enter that space, and only on one day of the year, and only after really elaborate rituals. The understanding was that somehow this is where God's presence, God's Shekinah, would dwell. A cube at the heart of where God connected with his people. But these systems, these spaces, the tabernacle, the temple, were always temporary, always unsatisfactory, because so much still got in the way of God and his people, his creation, in the way of the relationship they were made for. But this story has always been going somewhere. This God has always been at work, no more clearly than in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And in this vision of a new city, really a community, the presence, that's what that word glory is about, the presence of God isn't kept in a box. That presence isn't accessed by only one man on one day of the year. If you look ahead in this description, there's actually no temple in the city. The city doesn't need a temple. God isn't kept in a box. In this community, in this vision, God's glory, God's presence is everywhere. With his people, with his community, with his creation, because there are no more barriers, no buildings. The city is a community of people, just like the church is not the empty building with the images on the high street in Banchory. If we look ahead a little bit, those 12 gates I mentioned earlier on, they're not designed to keep people out. John tells us they are always open, never shut. And they're placed on every side, facing every direction to let people from every corner in. That image on the front of the building in the high street seems maybe like a label. Seems like it maybe has a price tag on it, but there are numbers on it, but they might look like a price, but underneath there's maybe something else. Perhaps someone, probably the empire, has tried to tell you that you have to buy your way in, that you have to earn your way in, that you have to behave a certain way, you have to fight, you have to grab to get in. In this image, if you look closely, underneath the label that appears to have a cost, there is the word free. This story is about freedom. This is a story about a God of compassion, a God of justice, a God who hears the cry and sets the captives free. This is about a God who says, "It is done." Everything that gets in the way is dealt with. And a God who offers to those who cry out, to the thirsty, water without cost. The water of life. Now, how does that make us feel?